Lessons Not Yet Learnt is a podcast that uncovers the costly mistakes that businesses keep making and how to finally move past them. Through storytelling, candid conversations, and expert perspectives, I'm on a mission to challenge outdated thinking, bring those overlooked lessons to the surface, and drive meaningful change, one story at a time. Hi, welcome to Lessons Not Yet Learnt. I'm your host, Kiran Kachela, and today I want to talk about a feeling. A feeling that probably makes your shoulders tense up just by thinking about it. I want you to take a moment and I want you to think back to a really bad working relationship. One of your worst working relationships ever. Perhaps it was a colleague or an employee or your boss or a supplier or a client. And I want you to think about what went on. What made it so difficult? Perhaps there was some passive aggressiveness, blame and finger pointing, conflict and bickering. Maybe there was some game playing and manipulation. The sleepless nights, that feeling of wanting to go home and just kick the cat, metaphorically, of course. That feeling of dread, feeling that self-doubt, anxious, and just feeling drained. These are all feelings that we've had at some point in our career, and it's absolutely awful. It's the worst thing when you dread going in the next day to work, when you dread that next meeting. And we spend so many hours at work. It's so difficult when all the joy has been sucked away from what we do. And for many, people actually leave jobs, not because they don't enjoy their job, not because of money or anything else, just purely because they've got a really toxic relationship. And it all boils down to one thing that I learned quite early on in my career. And that is that business is all about relationships. It's not about contracts. It's not about documents. It's not about commercials. It's about relationships. Contracts don't build trust. People do. When I think about some of the board meetings, some of the rooms I've sat in, I think back to how they felt. And there have been some rooms where I've just wanted the floor to suck me up because it's just uncomfortable. The air is filled with blame and conflict, and the conversations are borderline unprofessional. And then I've sat in rooms where I've seen those powerful and meaningful relationships, and things just happen. Things just get done. And it all comes back to relationships. Today, I want to focus on a particular mistake that I see organizations make all the time, and that is focusing too much attention on the contracts and the documents and not enough on building those sustainable, meaningful relationships. Let me give you an example. My company, CI Projects, were called in to support two major public sector contract reset programs. Now, the contract reset program is something that's only instigated when a relationship has gone terribly wrong and when the contract is nearing termination. When the contracts were first signed, everything was going great. There was this beautiful honeymoon period. There was lots of lovely handshakes, lots of pats on the backs, lots of big shiny smiles. But very quickly, things started to deteriorate. What had happened was those suppliers had invested months into winning the contract. And that focus on the documentation and the commercials and developing lots and lots of promises was where their attention was, and not necessarily on how they were actually going to deliver those promises. So some of those promises that were developed were actually designed to be broken because there was no thought about how they were going to deliver. So for the client, what they started to see was a number of promises that were broken, and they started to see that suppliers were not performing to the expected standard. And I remember sitting in some of those meetings with them, and it was just like a war zone. Everyone had their swords out and their shields out, and they were all bickering. There was just constant accusations. It felt like every sentence that came out of their mouth was an accusation at each other. And I remember thinking to myself in one of those meetings, this just isn't right. A client should come away from a meeting with their supplier feeling better, feeling happier, because they have assurance that their supplier has their back. This just isn't right. Now, these relationships went from good to bad to worse. And it got so bad that an intervention was needed. And that's when my team came in. We put together a really big contract reset program plan, working with all of the departments to work through how they were going to improve their performance and move them from red to green. And that was an extensive program. However, it wasn't just all about the mechanics of the performance. We needed to focus on rebuilding those relationships and that trust that had broken down. So what we did was we put together a bit of a collaborative working framework, and we facilitated a series of independent workshops between the suppliers and the clients to really uncover and expose some of those underlying feelings that they had, feelings of distrust, feelings of dislike, and really bringing those all to the surface, because until each party understood how the other party was feeling and the things they did and didn't like and the things they did and didn't trust, they couldn't move forward. So through a series of these workshops, plus the contract reset programs, we did actually start to see these contracts perform, and these contracts moved away from that point of termination and continued. However, it did cost all parties. It cost the suppliers hundreds and thousands of pounds because the client was out to penalise them because they were not performing. So there was a financial cost. There was an emotional and human cost, the emotional toll, the stress that it caused on everybody. But it also cost the client, because for the client, they weren't able to fulfill successfully their public service duty. It impacted every party, so nobody won in this battle. They had all forgotten their core purpose, why this partnership existed in the first place. And that was where the big mistake was. That understanding of why they existed, making sure there was alignment, making sure that they were working together to ensure that those outcomes were being delivered. Why? Because there was short-sightedness, because there was so much focus on the documentation and the contract and not enough focus on building and maintaining a sustainable, meaningful relationship. Now, building meaningful relationships isn't just about taking people out for dinners and wining and dining. And it's also not about the contracts and what you put in the contracts, because content is cheap these days. At the click of a button with AI, you can get content very easily. Actually, what it is all about is people and relationships. And that's why I'm really excited to introduce my guest today, James Saunders, who's actually been one of my clients before. We worked with him on a huge healthcare transformation program. And I can genuinely say we have a very positive and meaningful relationship. But that's not why I've brought him on the show today. James has over 2 decades of experience of working within the public and private sectors, having worked with big NHS healthcare trusts, also having worked with a number of different private sector organisations, and he truly gets partnerships. So much so that he's actually gone and built his own business, Partnerships Working, which does what it says on the tin. So I'm really intrigued to find out more. Hi, James. Thanks for coming along today.
Oh, brilliant. Really glad to be here, and so looking forward to talking about this important subject.
So, James, what's led you to set up a company focusing on partnerships?
I've worked kind of in and around this area, probably for the majority of my career. And I've worked kind of client side. I've worked on the provider side, I've done PFI, I've worked in sales, procurement. So I've pretty much always worked in and around companies working together. And that might be in the form of, joint ventures, it might be in the idea of a company that's outsourced a service line. And over that time, I've seen those partnerships work really well. But I've also seen those partnerships not work so well. And I think there's some statistics, something like, I think almost 50% of businesses will partner up with another business. But there's a kind of slightly depressing statistic, which is something like 70% of partnerships will fail in some form or other. So for me, really, I just see an opportunity to help these companies work better together, because when it does work, and you probably see this in, when you work well with your customers, you deliver massive value for them. It's good for you. It helps your business grow. So I just see there's so much opportunity for these businesses to work better together. And my particular passion is kind of in and around the public sector and the NHS, where I feel that actually the private sector can add a huge amount of value to the NHS. And if I can do something to help them work better together, then, it gives me that warm, fuzzy feeling that I'm doing something nice, but it helps the NHS and the public sector do things better. So yeah, I just think there's so much scope to improve things in this area, and that's why I set up the business.
That's amazing. Yeah, I mean, it's a win-win, right? It's a win-win for everybody. And there is genuinely a social impact at the back end of that partnership. There's a reason that partnership exists, and sometimes that can be lost. People lose sight of what the purpose is.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I think people can kind of get bogged down with kind of contracts and sort of personality clashes and things like that, and sort of they forget that actually the whole idea was trying to work together to achieve something. Customers will partner up with a company for a number of different reasons. It might be because they want to drive change, similar to the type of stuff you're doing. It might be because they want to save money, improve quality. So, the principles and the ideas and the reasons these companies enter in partnerships are absolutely sound. But unfortunately, sometimes as the relationships progress, they sometimes lose sight of what they're trying to do, and they're arguing and disputing about kind of what should be in the contract and what shouldn't be.
Yeah, exactly. So you've obviously seen in your decades of your career working across public and private sector, you've seen those really strong, healthy relationships, and you've also seen those that have failed. Give me an example of one of those that has failed.
I think one that really kind of stands out to me was the prisons contracts. I can speak quite openly about this because the company involved no longer exists. So this was the outsourcing of facilities management, so building maintenance, cleaning, that type of stuff, of the prisons across the south of England. And there was something like 54 prisons. It's a huge contract, it was 100 million a year contract, and it was first generation outsourcing. So the prisons had never outsourced these services, they'd always self-delivered, but they decided mainly to save money, but also to drive quality and improve compliance, they wanted to outsource. So they went through the tendering process, and Carillion won the contract. And I was involved with that contract once it was kind of in operations and trying to sort of improve some stuff. And I remember there talking to a sort of site manager, heads of works at the prison. And this guy had worked at the prison 15, 20 years, knew all the kind of manager and the management and the governor and things like that very well, had great relationships. And Carillion had won this contract. And as part of that process, the existing staff kind of transfer, they 2P over to the new provider. So this guy used to work for the prisons, but now worked for Carillion. And I remember talking to him kind of a couple of weeks after the contract had started. And he said that literally overnight, he was suddenly treated differently by his colleagues because he had a different uniform on, he had a Carillion uniform on. And, he was getting comments like the fact that he was a traitor, that he'd sort of was working for the other side. And this is someone who had, worked with these people for many, many years, but just that change in uniform, the change for a company, and also I think the fact that he now worked for the private sector just created this kind of barrier, this distrust between the individuals. And I think that occurs kind of at an individual level, but it just builds up so that you end up often with this type of distrust, skepticism between the kind of public sector and the private sector all the way up to the top. And I think it was just an example of just recognizing that when you bring different organizations together, particularly if you've got public and private sector involved, that they do have different priorities, they do have different values. And if you don't address some of that, these things can turn into much bigger issues. And as we both know, that was not the most successful contract for Carillion, and it ended up with multi-million-pound disputes and some fairly tense relationships and conversations. So I think it's just an example of, and it's almost this sort of tribalism thing, kind of a them and us. I work for this company, you work for that company, I'm right, you're wrong. And if you don't kind of recognize that and acknowledge that, as I say, the issues that you see on the ground just build and escalate into fundamental disagreements at a high level. And I think that's just one example of where these partnerships can go wrong, where you have that sort of them and us culture.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, this was a contract we both worked on, so I know it well. And it wasn't even that the person, that you spoke to, that guy on a site that you spoke to, did anything to, damage the relationship. It was purely just wearing a different uniform. So as you say, there was this tribalism. How does that come about, do you think?
I think there is this sort of, so I think in the area I work in, there's a particular sort of emotive side to this. I think, where you've got people sort of kind of being transferred from one organization to another, you've got people involved, and therefore you've got emotions involved. And I think particularly around that kind of public and private sector thing, where I think sometimes people have a sort of fundamental view that the private sector shouldn't be making profit from the public sector, which I think is a real shame, because I think, there is a win-win situation where a private organization can make profit, but still deliver value for money and a better quality service than the customer could have self-delivered, which is why they made the decision to outsource, because they recognise they couldn't do it themselves. So I think you see it particularly pronounced in that public-private sector. But I think it happens in any area. It's just, and I think, you see it in today's kind of political climate. It's a very sort of partisan, them and us. If you're not with me, you're against me.
Yeah.
And you see it kind of in the public, in the political space. But it happens when businesses work together. And I think the challenge is once an organization kind of forms a view about the other organization, they create this narrative that company is bad, that they're trying to rip me off, that they're not being transparent. Once you've created that narrative, people will just look for things to support that narrative.
Yeah.
And it's very hard once you're in that situation to kind of get out of it. So I think, this is kind of common. This is about people. This is about people working together, but recognizing that as soon as people are on different teams, that can create issues.
It's a perception, isn't it? And I often say perception is reality. So just because you believe, well, I'm doing things in a certain way and I don't, that they don't believe me and that's their problem. Actually, it is an us problem. It's not a them problem. And it is that perception is reality. If they have that perception of you, you do actually have to work hard to change that perception.
Yes. Yeah. Oh, absolutely. I sometimes talk to people about this kind of trust line, sort of above the line or below the line. And for me, there's this sort of metaphorical line. And when things are good, you're above the line. And, there will be issues. There's always issues. You're dealing with people, things go wrong. But when you're above that line in that sort of business partnership, if things go wrong, people go, they give you the benefit of the doubt. And they go, right, we've got a problem. Let's work together. Let's solve it. You learn from it and you move on. So that's when you're above the line. But when you're below the line, those little things become, the customer will almost see them as just, oh, here's another example of them of performing badly. I knew they were not very good, and here's another example. And it's really hard once you are below that line. People they create that perception, they create that narrative, they will look, human nature is that you will look for things to support your existing narrative. Just the way the brain works, it tries to save on kind of bandwidth. It doesn't look for things that disagree with its existing views. So once you're below that line, it's really, really hard to get out. And I think I've spoken of it a few times already, but trust, once you're below that line, there's a lack of trust. And as soon as you have a situation where the two organizations don't trust each other, you're constantly kind of second guessing them. don't believe necessarily what they're saying. And it's such a shame because kind of every hour that you're dealing with that mistrust is kind of an hour that you could be spending actually delivering a service to the customer. So I think, it is, once there is that perception, it's hard to shift and get out of.
And I've seen on many occasions from my experience, those relationships where they're almost at war because they're out to get each other. They're like enemies from the start almost. And so they've just lost sight of even there's no focus on building a partnership and trust.
No.
So how is it recoverable?
In my role, in my business, but certainly in previous roles, I've often kind of been called in or have come into sort of distressed contracts where there are existing disputes, either kind of big, disputes with a capital D, contractual lawyers or stuff like that, or just general kind of disagreements. And so often a lot of these issues came from the start of the contract. And I mean, I'm working on something at the moment with a customer, and it's a big FM contract, and it's kind of 5 years in, and the customer's starting to consider what they want to do with the contract after. And as part of it, I've been discussing or been talking to sort of the stakeholders of the customer, just to get, these are kind of the users, these are the people actually that feel the service, the facility service, just to get some feedback. And what's been fascinating is, broadly, they're not particularly happy with the current contract and the current provider. But when you dig in a bit, you realize that so many of their issues come from the start of the contract. So say contract's 5 years old, but kind of in year one, there were issues at the mobilisation, and the provider was probably not as transparent around things, and was perhaps not being as open as they could have been around what was working, but actually probably more importantly, what was not working. And they were effectively denying that there was an issue. And that, not surprisingly, really pissed off the customer, because the customer could see their issues. They could see that the door was taking too long to get repaired. They could see that jobs were being closed off, but they weren't actually being completed. Yet they were being told, no, it's all fine. The dashboard was green, the scores were green, and they were being told it's all fine. And these individuals, some quite senior people, they felt that they were being lied to.
Yeah.
And that creates a strong emotion. And there's the sort of saying from Maya Angelou about, people remember how you make them feel. And these individuals felt that they were being called liars. And this was 5 years ago, but that has stuck. So when you talk to them about how they perceive the service now, they call back to things that happened five years ago. And, if the company at the start had said, look, we've got it wrong, we know things aren't right, here's our solution, people would respect that. People would, because there's a kind of link here to sort of personal relationships. The fact is, if you show vulnerability, if you show that things aren't working, that actually creates trust, because the other party goes, do you know what? We're glad you've admitted to that, because we can see there's a problem and you can build on it. So, I think first it's just recognizing if you don't get it wrong at the start, it is very, very hard to fix. Are these things recoverable? Yeah, they are. But I think people need to go into it recognizing that there's inevitably fault on both parties. So often I see the kind of customer saying, oh, it's all the provider's fault. They're the ones who aren't doing this. They're the ones who aren't doing that. But then when you ask them around how they've managed the contract, when you ask them, well, have you provided feedback to your provider to say you're not happy? Oh, no, it's not for us to do. So I think these things are fixable, but I think it takes both organizations to recognize that they have fault. It requires both organizations to admit what they've done wrong, to be vulnerable. I think it also requires kind of buy-in from the very top of the business, because if people at the top of those organizations are not aligned, if they're not working together, then you've got no chance of the people on the ground, because, it trickles down. So, I think these things are fixable, but you need, again, it's similar to sort of a personal relationship. You need people to be committed, and you need people to recognize what they can do and to take accountability for their actions.
Absolutely. So that alignment, that transparency, that accountability, all absolutely critical in order to make a relationship work. And it does take two definitely does take two. And I, like you, I've seen on so many occasions people say, oh, well, it's them, and not taking any responsibility for why things aren't working. So have you got a really good example of where you've seen it work really well? You did say earlier 70% tend to fail in some shape or form. So have you come across any of the other 30%?
My immediate example is one that I was kind of directly involved with. So I'm not necessarily going to be taking credit for this, but I was involved with a big facilities management contract in a hospital, and it was working well. And I think there's a couple of reasons why it was working well. I think just individually we got on with each other. There was a good bunch of people from the customer side who were sensible, pragmatic, understood that things go wrong. And from my side, I had a great team that worked well with them. And I think the other reason it worked well is because we had good relationships at multiple levels. So sometimes I see issues where there'll be a great relationship between sort of one person on each side. But that's not enough. You kind of need this multi-level approach to that stakeholder side. You need the CEO of one company to be talking to the MD or the equivalent of their customer. And that needs to kind of be all the way down. So that was good. I think the other thing there we had that worked well was we had a sensible and realistic kind of contract and set of KPIs, because I think you see some contracts which have the most over-the-top, onerous, cumbersome set of KPIs and payment sort of performance management systems, and they don't add value, and they just create this cottage industry of reporting, and then people are just arguing the toss over whose data is correct and things like that. So here we had some good KPIs that actually added value. So KPIs around things like customer satisfaction.
Yeah.
So we were targeted on keeping the matrons of that hospital happy, because we knew that actually if they were happy, that that would be a good sign that the contract was working. And it just meant that when I was talking to the customer, we were having positive, collaborative conversations that just created a better conversation. So I think you had some good KPIs. I think it's a good people. I think the other thing as well, and it's something that is not talked about enough in sort of particularly public-private sector, is we talked about profit.
Yeah.
We making it clear to the customer that in certain areas we were not making as much profit. And sometimes people find it hard to have that conversation. But I think it's important, because ultimately, if as a private company I'm not making profit, and it has to be a reasonable profit, there's a difference between making profit and profiteering. But we spoke about profit, and it allowed us to have, again, a more grown-up conversation. And the customer went, okay, well, look, how can we work together to try and solve this? So I think, it's not rocket science, and it's simple, but these simple things so often get missed. And, before you know it, you're arguing about KPIs and you're arguing about contracts. So I think that there are good examples. And, in that instance, the FM provider was providing a good service. They were making a reasonable profit, and they were delivering a good service to the customer, which meant that they were having a better service for their patients and the like. So, it can work. And when it does work, it can do some great things. But I think they're probably some of the key things.
And as you say, they might be simple things, but they're so often overlooked because, you talked about KPIs. Measures drive behaviours. And if you have the wrong sets of KPIs, then you're going to have the wrong behaviours driven as a result. Yeah. And I'll just give you an example. I came across a KPI once within a healthcare trust. And this healthcare trust with their supplier had over 100 KPIs, firstly. And the clue is in the title, KPI, Key Performance Indicator, key. So we shouldn't have 100 KPIs.
If everything's key, then nothing's
really key. Yeah. So they had 100 KPIs, which in itself was the mistake. But then there was KPIs on there that no one really understood why they existed. And there was one, it was called a management KPI, which just needed a visual check once a month. And this visual check once a month was, okay, so I have this sign, a road sign, street sign, and you need to go and visually check this street sign once a month. And I challenged it. I said, why do we have to go and check that road sign, which is in concrete with a metal pole, with a standard street sign? Why do we have to go check that once a month? And everyone looked at each other and said, I have no idea. And then someone piped up and said, because once it was knocked down. And so instead of understanding why that might have happened, we've just gone and put another check in and believe it's a problem when it isn't. Yeah. And now no one's gone back and challenged, why do we have this KPI?
Yeah.
So it's just so important to, I would say, constantly reflect on your KPIs and constantly assess, are they adding value? Are they meaningful? Do they tell us anything? And actually, when you design KPIs focused on building better partnerships, they can have a real impact.
I think, I've got a similar anecdote. So there's a sort of saying that I read somewhere, which is, don't scar on the first cut. And so similar to what you said, and there's another example I had where I was actually at a hospital quite near here, and they had an issue with bikes. And these bikes were being left kind of locked up to railings for months on end. And there was a particular bike, I think security just got fed up and basically they cut the padlock off and got rid of the bike. Anyway, it turned out this bike was owned by quite a well-known consultant doctor in the hospital, and when he found that his bike had got taken, he got very upset, and as a result the organization then spent a lot of time creating a I think it was an unattended bike policy.
Right.
And so they created this whole policy, which then meant that security guards would have to go around every month, almost check in these bikes and log in how long they'd been there, just because one bike had been disposed of. And, it's this idea of things go wrong.
Yeah.
If your response can't be, right, we need to create another policy or we need to create another process, because as I'm sure you see in your industry, you go to these organizations and they've just added in layer upon layer of process. And again, you know what it's like, it's very hard to take things away once it's in. That's and then, sorry, just on the KPIs, I mean, that's one where we had a customer and they wanted engineers to be self-logging tasks. They wanted them to be the eyes and the ears of the customer. They didn't want it to be them that was always logging the tasks. So we created, and actually I think we linked it to the engineer's bonus scheme. We said, right, you need to log, I can't remember, X amount of jobs a month. And if you do, you'll get a bonus. And there's a whole thing around, incentives, drive behaviors. And I remember we had some issues with one of the sites because basically we weren't responding to the tasks quick enough. The SLAs were not being met. And I went and spent some time with one of the engineers. I was like, look, we're getting these jobs, but we're just, we're not responding quick enough. Why do you not have enough time? He's like, no, I haven't got enough time. I'm like, why not? He's, well, I've got to make sure that I go and log the jobs.
I'm busy logging the jobs.
He was, and this was the thing. So the KPI was created with the right principle and with the right intention, but actually it created.
But it drove the wrong behavior.
It drove the wrong behaviors. And I'm a big believer in kind of, I think, again, there's the saying from something like Warren Buffett or something like that, which is like, show me the incentive and I'll show you the behavior.
Yeah.
Coming back, I mean, KPIs are so important. And if you have the right KPIs, then it creates the right conversation. But if you have 100 plus KPIs, they're not, they're not adding value.
No.
But I think sometimes it's hard for a customer. You'll say to them, what's important? Oh, it's all important.
Yeah.
But really what's important? And then that sometimes requires them to get alignment in their organization to go, do you know what? These are the 4 things. And if you had the right KPIs, then, they're the ones you talk about. They're the ones you focus, because if you get that right, everything kind of falls into place.
Absolutely. And the other thing you've talked about quite a lot is alignment. And you've talked about being transparent and that difficult conversation that sometimes private sector, or a supplier might have in being quite transparent about the fact that one of their motives will be profit, naturally, because they're a business,
Absolutely.
Right? But that can be quite a difficult conversation or difficult to talk about sometimes. And I think you're absolutely right. That needs to be transparent. How do you think organizations can bring better alignment with some of those more difficult conversations?
There's definitely something about trying to get it right at the start, because I think it's this kind of cliche of kind of first impressions count. And I think being upfront with each other at the start around your objectives, your priorities, but also understanding how the values of those organizations, and, being vulnerable around what you're concerned about, what you're worried about. I think listening to each other. So yeah, certainly at the start, trying to just tease some of that stuff out, because that can often highlight issues or ways of ways of you need to sort of focus your attention on. So I think, just trying to get that alignment, and being okay having those slightly uncomfortable conversations, because they'll be thinking, your customer will be thinking some of this stuff. So make it visible, make it, shine a light on it so that you can then talk about those things. It reminds me of another situation of where there was a customer who we were working with, and he was convinced that his provider was, there was two big issues for him. First of all, there was a big piece around invoicing. The invoicing wasn't accurate. He felt he was being double charged for certain elements, and that effectively that the company was trying to make more profit and cooking the books. And then the other part was the reporting he was getting sort of just wasn't, he felt it wasn't true, wasn't transparent, wasn't reflective of reality, and again was convinced that they were kind of massaging stuff to reduce their penalties. And then when I went to go and speak to the provider to kind of understand what was going on, it became apparent very quickly that they weren't kind of intentionally doing all this. They just didn't have the systems or the processes in place. And a lot of this was just incompetence. They weren't intentionally, they didn't have the right system in place between finance and ops, and therefore they didn't actually know what they needed to be invoicing. And the systems didn't talk to each other, so the reports weren't accurate. And there's something called Hanlon's razor, and it's this idea of like, don't attribute malice where you could probably attribute it to incompetence. So basically, don't assume they're trying to stitch you up. It may just be the fact that they're not very good at what they do. Now, don't get me wrong, the output is still the same, but the solution becomes different. Yeah, the solution becomes different, because actually, rather than dealing with a company that is, intentionally misleading you and that you can't trust, you're dealing with a company that has got mistakes and you want to work with them. So I think, again, it comes back to that. Once people create this narrative and this perception, it's very hard to shift.
Yeah, absolutely. I've seen it on both ends, really. I have seen organisations that, perhaps not because they're just trying to cook the books, but also because culturally within their own organisation, there is this driver to show everything as green, right? Green on the dashboard, no reds, no ambers, where when you see green every single month and everything is perfect and never present on your report that there's an issue, then of course that's going to raise a bit of alarm bells for the recipient to say, well, really? That's not what I'm seeing. So I have seen those environments where actually you are seeing those green dashboards every month, and it does raise questions. But equally, you're absolutely right around sometimes they just don't have the systems and the processes in place to actually make sure that they're measuring this effectively, delivering this effectively, supporting their client effectively. And so that level of, I guess, developing that groundwork actually as part of that establishment of the relationship is important, because I see a lot of contracts won often on, lots of great promises around what we're going to do, with little information about how they're going to do it. So there's a lot of, we're going to give you this, we're going to give you that, we're going to deliver the world. But actually, when you get under the skin of it and say, well, how are you going to deliver that? No one's given that any thought.
No, I mean, I've done sales, so I'm possibly guilty of this at times. It's easy to put something on a piece of paper or in a presentation. So we're going to do that. Yeah, we're going to do that. But ultimately, to do that, you need to be changing things. And, you're probably trying to change cultures and processes that have been in place for many, many years.
Yeah.
And as people are resistant to change. And it's easy to say, we're going to put in a new system that's going to give you great reporting. But if you're reliant on individuals to change their way of working, it becomes much harder. Absolutely. I think how you're going to deliver things, how you're going to make that change is important. I think, just coming back to this thing of sort of people not necessarily being open about stuff. I mean, how frustrating it is when something is wrong. You know that something is not right, yet you're being told by the other person, no, it's fine. No, this is fine. And you're like, no, it's not. And you know how that makes you feel.
Yeah.
And this is, you see this in customers when, unfortunately, companies are afraid of saying that things aren't right. And actually, I mean, that example I gave a while ago around, the contract that was 5 years in and had a bad start. Some of it was around because the estates and facilities team for the customer, they didn't want to be open. So actually the FM provider may have been saying, look, I've got a few issues here, but actually the estates and facilities team didn't want to be open and with the wider stakeholder to say things aren't working because that would look bad on them. And this is, just come back.
It's a culture, isn't it? It's a culture. And it's everybody's responsibility, particularly that alignment at a senior level, to create that psychological safety, to create that safety net to say, it's okay to expose when things aren't right, because actually we can actually improve that. It's a good thing. It's a good thing to expose the things that aren't working, because then we can improve.
Absolutely. I think is it the Cotter change management stuff, like one of the first stages, recognize you've got a problem. And it's a bit like, I think it's one of the first stages kind of Alcoholics Anonymous, is recognize you've got a problem. Because if you don't have that acknowledgement, you can't do anything from it. And I had a role with an organization where I was kind of heading up sort of performance and improvement. And it was a challenge because the organization didn't want to necessarily recognize that they had room for improvement. And it was hard, because it's like, if you as an organization are not recognizing that you need to improve, it's very hard for me in my role to get people, because they're like, no, we're the best. So I think, having that acknowledgement and that recognition is so important. But again, I think, don't get me wrong, if you keep getting things wrong, and if you keep going, we've got it wrong again, at some point, that's not good enough. But if you're open and transparent, again, same in sort of personal relationships, when someone opens up to someone else, often the natural reaction is for that person to open up about themselves, because you create that psychological safety. And it's, who's the chap? Patrick Lencioni. He talks about this in terms of creating teams and trust. And so much of it starts from vulnerability. So I think, having that safety where both organizations can admit when they're not getting it wrong is so important, and but it can create the foundation for kind of great partnerships.
Absolutely. And then learning lessons from it, like you say. So we're not repeating the same mistakes over and over and over again, which is what this whole podcast is all about. So talking of which, so what's the one lesson that you feel organizations have not yet learned that you want to share today?
I think that it's recognizing that it's not contracts that make successful partnerships, it's people. And I think if organizations spent more time on getting people to work better together and literally focusing on, how do we get this director and that director to engage? What do we need to do? Let's take them on an away day or what have you. Because if you can get that bit right, if you can get the people piece right, if you can have people in a room together who want to work together with shared goals, shared values, a shared vision, and trust, then you can do wonderful stuff. So I think, it's just acknowledging it's the people that make successful partnerships, not the contract.
Couldn't agree more. Thank you so much for coming today, James.
You're welcome. And could I just say, I've known you now sort of 10 plus years, and known you since
long time.
You sort of started off as a sort of one-man band, and it's just so great to kind of see the progress and the development and the growth that you've done, and the fact that you've got this in these nice offices, and it's just really good to see. So I've
been lucky enough to work with great people like you. So it's all about those strong partnerships.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Today's CI Fix is all about building transparency and building alignment to develop that true, meaningful, sustainable relationship. Now, one of the things we do quite often is bring those parties together quite early on in the process to actually pull out what are those true value drivers, what really matters to both parties. So we make sure that we ask those questions around, what does value mean for you? And it creates this psychologically safe place where suppliers can talk about things like profit, and clients can talk about things like social value and the impact it has on their end users. It's so important to create that common understanding and alignment to be able to have a fruitful relationship and a positive outcome. Thank you for joining today's episode, and I look forward to seeing you next time.